My name is Danielle Peterson, and I was 32 years old when I learned how quietly entitlement can hide behind smiles, shared holidays, and the word family. At the time, I was engaged to Michael Reynolds, 31, a corporate attorney I had been with for just over 4 years. We met through mutual friends, moved in slowly, and built what I believed was a stable, respectful partnership. I worked in tech as a senior systems architect, made good money, lived comfortably but responsibly, and had paid off my own student loans years earlier through discipline I was quietly proud of. Michael and I talked about the future often: children, careers, finances, timelines. Everything seemed aligned. Or at least that's what I thought. The wedding was scheduled for early spring. Deposits were paid, vendors booked invitations half designed. The stress felt normal, manageable. Nothing felt wrong enough to question. That illusion shattered 2 weeks before everything fell apart. Michael's parents, Harold Reynolds and Diane Reynolds, invited me to dinner. Just me. They said Michael had a late meeting and couldn't make it, but they wanted to talk through some family logistics before the wedding. I assumed they meant their contribution to the reception or seating arrangements. Diane had always liked control disguised as generosity. Harold liked authority disguised as tradition. Their house was immaculate in the way only people who never worry about money can manage. The table was formally set, no casual warmth, no wine poured yet. Harold didn't waste time. After the plates were cleared, he stood, walked to the sideboard, and returned with a thick folder labeled "Tabbed Organized." That was the first moment my stomach tightened. "Danielle," he said, folding his hands, "now that you're officially joining the family, we need to discuss Michael's financial situation." I blinked polite. "Okay." Diane slid the folder toward me. "Michael has approximately $150,000 in student loan debt from law school. As his wife, you'll be assuming responsibility for that." For a second, I genuinely thought this was a joke. I laughed once short and surprised, waiting for them to laugh too. They didn't. I reminded them calmly that Michael and I had already discussed keeping premarital debts separate. That was a boundary we both agreed on early in our relationship. Harold shook his head. "That's not how marriage works in our family," he said. "A wife supports her husband. Period." Diane leaned forward. "You make significantly more money. Michael shouldn't have to struggle when his wife is successful." Michael earned a respectable salary, but it wasn't true that he struggled. What he did do was spend freely while making minimum payments. I knew that. I had watched him buy watches, take weekend trips live as though the debt would someday vanish. They slid an amortization schedule across the table. Monthly payments, refinancing options, timelines. It wasn't a conversation, it was a presentation. I asked one question. "Does Michael know you're having this discussion with me?" Diane smiled tightly. "He doesn't. He's too proud to ask, but we know he's stressed." Something inside me went quiet. I sat there looking at people who had hugged me at holidays, toasted our engagement, spoken about family values, and realized I was being cornered politely, deliberately, with the assumption that refusal was not an option. So I smiled. "You're right," I said evenly. "It's only fair." Diane beamed. Harold relaxed. I drove home in silence, already knowing the wedding was over, even if no one else did yet. I didn't tell Michael about the dinner with his parents. Not that night, not the next morning, not even when he kissed my forehead and asked how dinner went, already half distracted by his phone. I simply said it was fine, and let the word hang there unfinished like a sentence, missing its most important clause. I needed to know whether that ambush had been their idea alone, or whether he was standing quietly behind it, letting them do what he didn't want to say out loud. For the first few days, nothing happened. No confession, no awkward follow-up. Then casually, over takeout on the couch, Michael mentioned that his mother had been asking questions about our long-term financial planning and whether we were aligned about shared responsibilities after marriage. He said it lightly like an afterthought, but my chest tightened anyway. It was confirmation without admission, a breadcrumb meant to normalize something that should have been discussed honestly, directly, and long before a ring ever touched my finger. That was when I started documenting everything. Not out of spite, and not because I planned to throw it in anyone's face, but because a quiet instinct told me that reality mattered and that facts would be my anchor when emotions inevitably tried to rewrite the narrative. I went through bank statements, emails, receipts, buried in folders I hadn't opened in years. I built a spreadsheet the same way Harold had, only mine told a different story. Gifts over 4 years, just over $12,000, including jewelry, electronics, and designer items Michael insisted he needed for work or image. Travel $18,000, most of it upgrades, because he refused to fly economy and said it made him feel cheap. Car repairs and maintenance $5,000 because his budget was always tight that month. Rent support during what he called a temporary rough patch that somehow lasted 8 months, $8,000. My half of wedding deposits already paid $7,000. The total landed just under $50,000, and that didn't include groceries, dates, subscriptions, or the hundreds of small expenses that never felt worth tracking until suddenly they were. What hurt wasn't the number. I had chosen to spend that money willingly, believing it was part of building a shared life. What hurt was realizing how naturally one-sided it had been, how easily generosity had been mistaken for obligation. To be sure, I tested the truth gently. One evening, I asked Michael what he thought about handling student loans in marriage, framing it as hypothetical curiosity rather than accusation. He didn't hesitate. Of course, they become joint responsibility, he said. That's what partnership means. When I flipped the scenario and asked if he would help me pay off debt if our roles were reversed, he laughed almost affectionately and said it wasn't the same. I made more money. I could afford it. It wouldn't be fair to expect him to sacrifice when I didn't have to. That was the moment something inside me hardened into clarity. He didn't see partnership. He saw security. He saw my stability as a resource meant to absorb his risk, his choices, his debt. And worse, he saw nothing wrong with it. That night, while he slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, understanding, with brutal calm, that this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved. It was a belief system. And belief systems don't change because someone gets uncomfortable. By morning, my decision was already made. I contacted a close friend who specialized in contract law and asked for advice, careful to frame everything as preparation rather than retaliation. I canceled what vendors I could absorb, the deposits I couldn't recover, and accepted the sting as a necessary cost of freedom. Losing money hurt, but not as much as the thought of spending decades paying for someone else's sense of entitlement. I didn't confront Michael yet. I wanted one thing first, the truth spoken aloud without his parents' voices guiding it. So I waited, and I planned. 3 days after the dinner with Harold and Diane, I invited Michael's entire family over to our apartment. I told Michael I had a surprise related to the wedding, something I wanted to share with everyone at once. He looked genuinely excited, the kind of excited that comes from expectation rather than certainty. He kissed me, told me he loved me, and went to change his shirt while I finished setting up the living room. I ordered catering from his favorite restaurant, the one he always said felt too expensive for regular nights, but never hesitated to suggest when he wasn't paying. I laid out plates, opened a bottle of champagne, and made the room look warm and celebratory because irony. I was learning lands harder when it's wrapped in comfort. When Harold and Diane arrived, they were dressed as if attending a formal event. Michael's sister, Cynthia Reynolds, came with her husband, Brett Reynolds, both of them smiling politely, unaware they were walking into the end of something rather than a beginning. Michael hovered near me as everyone settled in. "You're making me nervous," he said with a laugh. "What's all this about?" "I just wanted everyone together," I replied steady. "Especially your parents." Harold raised his glass, clearly pleased. Diane squeezed his hand. I waited until everyone was seated before speaking again. "I've been thinking a lot about the conversation you had with me last week," I said, looking directly at Harold and Diane. Michael's brow furrowed confusion flickering across his face. "You were right. When you marry someone, you take on their responsibilities. It's only fair." Michael smiled, relief spreading across his features. Diane's expression softened into something dangerously close to triumph. That was when I reached for my own folder and placed it on the coffee table. "And that's why we need to talk about Michael's financial obligations to me." The room went silent so completely that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Michael stared at me, his smile collapsing into disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he asked, voice unsteady. I opened the folder, flipping it toward him, toward his parents, toward everyone. "Over the past 4 years," I said calmly, "I've contributed approximately $50,000 to this relationship beyond normal shared expenses. Gifts, travel, rent support, car repairs, and wedding deposits. According to the logic presented to me, premarital financial contributions become joint responsibility once marriage is on the table, which means Michael owes me half before we move forward." Harold stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "Is it?" I asked. You said marrying into a family means taking on obligations. Michael's obligation to me is $25,000. Are you writing the check, or should I expect it from him? Michael looked at his parents, then back at me, panic rising. Danielle, those were gifts. You can't just— No, I interrupted gently. According to your parents, they were investments in our future. And according to you, financial responsibilities in marriage are shared. I'm just applying the same rules. Diane's voice shook with anger. You're being cruel. I'm being consistent. I took a breath, then said the words I had rehearsed until they felt solid. The wedding is canceled. I've notified the vendors. You'll be receiving bills for your portion of the non-refundable deposits. That's another $7,000. Michael's face drained of color. You're ending our wedding over money. No, I said, meeting his eyes. I'm ending it because you and your parents tried to corner me into assuming $150,000 of debt without honesty, consent, or respect. You knew about their plan. You expected me to accept it because I could afford it. He didn't deny it. He just whispered, I didn't think you'd mind. That was answer enough. I asked him to pack his things and be out by Friday. He nodded numbly, surrounded by the wreckage of expectations he had never questioned. As his parents argued, and Cynthia watched in stunned silence, I felt something strange settle over me. Not anger, not relief, just clarity. I thought the hardest part would be the confrontation the moment everything fractured in front of witnesses. I was wrong. The hardest part came the next day when entitlement stopped pretending to be hurt and revealed itself as something uglier. Michael had agreed to move out by Friday. He texted that he needed time to process that he would come by when I was home to collect his things. I believed him because part of me still wanted to believe the man I thought I knew was in there somewhere, embarrassed but fundamentally decent. That illusion lasted exactly 12 hours. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was my neighbor Edward Miller, a retired Marine who lived across the hall and had once fixed my door without being asked because he noticed it sticking. His voice was calm but urgent. Danielle, he said, your fiancé is loading your television into a rental truck. You might want to come home. I left immediately. When I pulled into the parking lot, a large rental van sat open its back, half filled with items I recognized instantly. My gaming console, my espresso machine, my television. Things I had purchased, documented, and paid for long before Michael ever moved in. He stood there directing a mover, acting like someone clearing out property that was rightfully his. What are you doing? I asked, my voice steady but cold as I stepped out of my car. Michael turned, eyes flashing with a mix of defensiveness and wounded pride. Taking what I'm owed, he said, You humiliated me. You owe me for emotional damage. That's theft, I replied. Put everything back. He laughed sharp and hollow. It's compensation. You promised to take care of me. I didn't argue. I called the police. When they arrived, Michael tried to frame it as a domestic dispute, claiming we were engaged and that the property was shared. Edward stood quietly to the side until asked, then calmly explained that he had watched Michael load the items while I was at work. I showed the officers text messages where Michael admitted he was moving out along with receipts proving I had purchased every item in question. One officer looked at Michael and asked, Are you married to her? We're engaged, Michael said quickly. The officer nodded. Then this isn't marital property. You need to unload the truck. Michael's face twisted as he put everything back under supervision. He accused me of financial abuse, of cruelty, of betrayal. The officer listened patiently before responding. Ma'am, not giving someone money is not abuse. And unless you have a written agreement stating otherwise, she has no legal obligation to support you. That sentence echoed in my head long after the officers left. Obligation. It was the word everyone had used so freely until it finally meant nothing at all. That night, I called my lawyer friend again. Not out of anger, but because I wanted this to end cleanly, decisively, without room for reinterpretation. We drafted a formal demand letter, itemized, professional, complete with receipts and bank statements. Not because I expected repayment, but because I wanted boundaries in writing. At the bottom, we included a settlement offer. I would waive the entire amount if Michael and his family acknowledged the relationship ended due to financial deception, agreed to no further contact, and returned my grandmother's engagement ring. 3 days later, Harold hired a lawyer. The call I received from him was the closest thing to laughter I had felt in weeks. The lawyer introduced himself professionally, but there was a pause in his voice that told me he already understood exactly what this situation was. He confirmed what I already knew, that gifts freely given during a relationship aren't legally recoverable, and I agreed without argument. Then I explained the point of the letter. Another pause, longer this time, followed by a quiet exhale. I see, he said. Between us, Harold wanted to countersue for breach of promise. I advised him not to. Filing alone would cost more than your entire demand. He was not pleased. That was enough for me. I wasn't interested in dragging this through court. I wanted closure, not spectacle. The lawyer confirmed that engagement rings were considered conditional gifts in our state. Because I had called off the wedding, Michael technically had a right to keep it, but proving fraud would be difficult. In the end, Michael agreed to return the ring in exchange for dropping all demands and ending contact. I accepted. When he handed it back to me a week later, he couldn't meet my eyes. Diane muttered something about my lack of class. Harold called me cold. I didn't respond. The online fallout, however, didn't wait. Michael posted a long, emotional message about being abandoned over financial stress. Friends of his flooded my inbox with accusations and advice I hadn't asked for. I stayed silent for 24 hours, then posted one response. I laid out exactly what had happened, attached screenshots of messages, where Michael admitted he knew about his parents' plan, and ended with a single sentence, "I don't have financial insecurities. I have financial boundaries." The reaction was immediate and brutal. The narrative flipped. Comments turned from sympathy to skepticism. Michael's sister Cynthia reached out privately, apologizing, and admitting she and Brett had never known about their parents' demand. She revealed something else, too. Harold and Diane had told Michael they paid off Brett's business loan as a wedding gift. In reality, they had given $10,000 toward an already profitable venture. They had inflated their generosity to justify expectations they'd never met themselves. Michael tried to regain control. He accused me publicly of being financially abusive and controlling. He started a crowdfunding page for his student loans, framing himself as escaping a toxic relationship. It raised less than $200, most of it from his mother. His law firm noticed. They didn't like the attempted theft incident or the public meltdown. Edward had recorded the rental truck incident on his phone. That video circulated quietly through professional channels. Michael received a formal warning about his conduct. By then, the truth was louder than any story he tried to tell. And it wasn't finished yet. Stop! Part 6. 3 months later. 3 months is not a long time in the grand scheme of things, but it's long enough for consequences to settle into place and for illusions to finally stop echoing. By then, the chaos had burned itself out, leaving behind something quieter and far more revealing. Michael moved back in with Harold and Diane. Not temporarily, not until things stabilized, but fully permanently into the same bedroom he'd sworn he would never return to. His student loans went into collections after he missed multiple payments. I found out through Cynthia, who reached out again not to stir drama, but because she seemed genuinely shaken by how quickly everything had unraveled. Michael had been shopping instead of paying. Still convinced on some level that the problem would resolve itself the way it always had, with someone else stepping in. That someone never came. At work, things deteriorated fast. The formal warning became a performance improvement plan after 2 more incidents involving unprofessional behavior and excessive personal activity during office hours. Apparently, he spent company time scrolling dating apps, searching for what Cynthia called a financial reset rather than focusing on cases. The firm didn't fire him outright, but the message was clear. His reputation had been damaged and patience was thin. Harold called me once. Just once. He didn't apologize. He didn't even sound angry. He asked if I would reconsider, framed it as practical rather than emotional, as if what we'd lost was an arrangement, not a relationship. I blocked the number without responding. Some conversations don't deserve words. The wedding vendors kept most of the deposits exactly as the contract stated. When Michael's family threatened bad reviews, the vendors shut that down immediately, with screenshots of cancellation policies and timestamps. Professional boundaries, unlike emotional ones, are harder to manipulate. I learned through mutual friends that Michael had started seeing someone new, a woman he met at a bar who worked in finance. He told her he was debt-free and financially independent. I gave that relationship 3 months, maybe less. Lies like that don't age well under pressure. As for me, I went to Iceland alone. The trip that was supposed to be a honeymoon became something else entirely, a quiet reclamation. I hiked, slept late, ate alone without feeling lonely, and let the silence remind me what peace actually feels like. When I came back, I turned Michael's old closet into a home office. I sold my grandmother's ring, kept what it was worth to me emotionally, and donated the rest to a financial literacy charity in Michael's name. They sent him a thank you card. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. Looking back, I don't regret a single lost dollar. $7,000 in deposits was cheap compared to $150,000 in debt and a lifetime of quiet expectation. If someone believes they're entitled to your stability simply because you love them, they don't love you back. They love what you absorb for them. Some people play stupid games and call it tradition. Others finally walk away. I walked away. My name is Bianca Harrison, and I'm 32 years old, and I'm writing this from a hotel room that was supposed to be my honeymoon suite. The wedding was meant to be tomorrow. Instead, I'm sitting alone with a glass of whiskey I don't usually drink, staring at unfamiliar wallpaper, and feeling something unexpected beneath the shock and sadness relief. Not the kind you admit out loud right away, but the quiet, steady kind that creeps in once the noise dies down. Let me explain how it all unraveled in the span of one dinner. I was engaged to Anthony, my boyfriend of 4 years, until last night. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, one of those crowded gatherings where you don't expect anything meaningful to happen. He was charming in an understated way, observant, thoughtful. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. We clicked immediately. Dating turned serious fast. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. After 2 years, we moved in together. Last October, during a quiet weekend trip, he proposed. I said yes without hesitation. I genuinely believed I had found my person. Anthony came from money. Not flashy new money, old established, insulated. His father was a retired pharmaceutical executive. His mother came from generational wealth and ran a charity foundation that everyone spoke about in reverent tones. They lived in a gated community where the houses looked identical in their perfection and the help was never acknowledged by name. I came from something simpler. I'm an electrical engineer. I make good money, about $115,000 a year. I own a modest townhouse, drive a reliable car, and have retirement savings I built myself. My parents are teachers. Honest, warm, unpretentious people who work their entire lives without expecting applause. From the beginning, Anthony's parents were cordial, polite enough to deny outright hostility, distant enough to make every interaction feel like a test. His father asked about my 5-year plan like we were in a boardroom. His mother made comments about my quaint townhouse and my humble background, always smiling while she did it. I brushed it off. Anthony brushed it off harder. They're traditional, he'd say. They don't mean it that way. I told myself love required patience. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself a lot of things. The rehearsal dinner was last night, a private room at an expensive restaurant. 40 guests, both families, the wedding party, close friends. My parents had flown in from 3 states away. Everyone was dressed beautifully, laughing, raising glasses to our future. For the first hour, it felt almost normal. I let myself relax. I even smiled. Then Anthony's father stood up and tapped his glass. He said he wanted to address something important. His mother nodded beside him, composed, prepared. I thought it was going to be a welcome speech. I really did. Instead, he said calmly and clearly that I wasn't truly one of them, that I didn't fit their family values, that while I seemed like a nice enough young woman, I couldn't provide the life their son deserved. His mother followed, explaining that this wasn't cruelty, just honesty, that I would never belong in their circles, that the marriage could damage their reputation. The room went silent. I looked at Anthony. He was staring at his plate, not defending me, not interrupting them, just silent. His sister smirked. My mother's eyes filled with tears. My father's jaw tightened. Anthony's father finished by offering me an out, promising to cover the cancellation costs if I walked away quietly. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, just cleanly. I stood up, thanked them for their honesty, told them they were right. I didn't share their values because mine included basic decency. Then I canceled the wedding, right there. I told Anthony I loved him for 4 years, and he sat there while they destroyed us. That was my answer. I told my parents we were leaving. They stood immediately. Behind me, Anthony finally spoke, asking me to wait. His parents said nothing. That silence told me everything. We didn't say a word on the ride back to my parents' hotel. My mother stared out the window silently crying, the kind of quiet sobbing that comes from trying not to fall apart in front of your child. My father drove with both hands tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, his jaw set in a way I'd only seen a handful of times in my life. When we got to the hotel, my mom finally broke. She didn't cry about the wedding. She cried about the things that had been said about me, about us, about how a room full of people had been allowed to hear my family reduced to something lesser. My father, who almost never swears, called Anthony's parents the most pathetic excuse for human beings he'd ever encountered. Hearing that from him, steady, measured, endlessly patient, hit harder than any shouting ever could have. That night, my phone didn't stop buzzing. Texts from bridesmaids, from Anthony's friends, from relatives who'd heard something vague but alarming. I didn't have the energy to explain. My best friend stepped in and helped me draft a single message, wedding canceled. Long story. I'll explain when I can. It was sent out like a controlled burn, short and factual, no emotion for anyone to twist. Still, the damage was immediate. The venue, the caterer, the florist, the photographer. Every call felt like reopening the wound, explaining over and over that no, there wouldn't be a wedding tomorrow. No, it wasn't a misunderstanding. Yes, I was sure. That's when the financial reality hit me in full. I had paid for most of the wedding, around 70%. Anthony's parents had offered to contribute, but every offer came with conditions, specific vendors, specific choices, specific appearances to maintain. Eventually, I'd said I'd handle it myself. Their actual contribution. $3,000 for the rehearsal dinner, the same dinner where they publicly humiliated me. The total wedding cost was just under $48,000. My share was about $34,000. Money I'd saved carefully over years. Money that was supposed to mark the start of a shared life. Most vendors had strict cancellation policies this close to the date. I expected the worst. But something unexpected happened when I started making calls the next morning. The venue coordinator listened quietly, then said she couldn't refund the deposit, but she could hold a credit for a future event. "You sound like you dodged a bullet," she told me. The caterer worked with me to transfer the deposit to my best friend's upcoming engagement party. He reimbursed me later. The photographer, who'd seen things like this before, refunded 50% even though she didn't have to. By the end of it, I recovered about $12,000. I still lost over $22,000. It hurt, but not as much as marrying into that family would have. Anthony, meanwhile, started rewriting the story. The first wave was texts, dozens of them, accusing me of humiliating him, saying his parents were just being protective, telling me I overreacted, begging me to talk so we could fix this. I didn't respond. Then his sister messaged me, calling my reaction dramatic, telling me I should be grateful for the reality check. I replied once carefully, stating the facts, then blocked her. After that came the mutual friends, the ones who always want to understand both sides, asking if I was sure I hadn't taken things too far, suggesting I apologize to smooth things over. Apologize for what? For not being born into wealth. The entitlement escalated 3 days later when a certified letter arrived. Anthony's parents' attorney. They were demanding reimbursement $3,000 for the rehearsal dinner, $5,000 for emotional distress to their son, $2,500 for the non-refundable portion of Anthony's wedding suit, and $1,200 for bachelor party expenses they'd covered. Total $11,700. I read it twice, then laughed a sharp, disbelieving sound that surprised even me. The audacity of it all sat heavy in my chest. I called my cousin, a paralegal, who reviewed the letter, and laughed too. She told me it was intimidation barely dressed up as legality. No grounds, no standing. I didn't want to ignore it, though. I wanted a record. With her help, I drafted a response, polite, factual, unyielding, laying out exactly why their claims were baseless, and warning that further contact would be considered harassment. I sent it certified mail, then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Anthony showed up at my townhouse the following Sunday afternoon. No warning, no text, just the doorbell ringing, while my best friend and I were half watching a football game, the sound slicing through the room like a knife. I knew who it was before I even stood up. Some instinct had already tightened in my chest. When I opened the door and saw him there, unshaven, eyes, red clothes, rumpled like he'd slept in them, I felt a strange mix of pity and distance. Not anger, not longing. Distance. "We need to talk," he said, voice cracking before he'd even finished the sentence. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied. I meant it. He begged for 5 minutes. Said he deserved that after 4 years. My best friend watched quietly from the couch, ready to intervene if needed. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, creating a physical boundary to match the emotional one I'd been building since the rehearsal dinner. Talk, I said. He cried immediately, apologized in gasps, said he'd been in shock at the dinner, that he hadn't known how to react, that his parents had always been like that, controlling, domineering, impossible to confront. He told me he loved me, that he wanted to fix this, that he was willing to choose me now. The words came fast, desperate, rehearsed, in the way only regret can make them. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked a single question. "Where were they?" I said quietly, "when you asked me to stay." He blinked, confused. I explained. When he finally spoke up at the restaurant, when he asked me to reconsider, his parents didn't say a word. They didn't apologize. They didn't stop me. They sat there in silence because they got exactly what they wanted. I told him I'd seen his father's notes on a napkin. That speech wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. Strategy, not emotion. His face collapsed. He tried to defend them weakly, saying they thought they were protecting him. From what I asked. From a woman who loved you and was about to marry you, I reminded him of every holiday I'd felt like an outsider, every dinner where his mother had commented on my upbringing, every time his father questioned whether I could provide. "You had 4 years to choose me," I said. "You never did." I told him goodbye, turned around, and went back inside. I locked the door while he was still standing there, mid-sob. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next week, things shifted from emotional chaos to something darker. First, his mother started calling my parents, the same people she'd dismissed as beneath them. My mother called me furious, saying Anthony's mother had accused her of raising me to be vindictive and petty, urged her to convince me to reconsider for everyone's sake. My mother, who spent her career teaching elementary school, shut her down and threatened a harassment complaint if she called again. I'd never been prouder. Then the narrative started spreading. Friends I barely spoke to anymore suddenly reached out asking if I was okay, if I was having a breakdown. Apparently, Anthony's father was telling people I couldn't handle constructive criticism and had stormed out like a child. Constructive criticism. That was the phrase he used to describe public humiliation. I didn't defend myself publicly. I didn't post online. I quietly removed photos and changed my relationship status. But the story was being written without me. And then the line was crossed. I got an alert from my bank, a failed login attempt, then another. 2-factor authentication blocked it, thankfully. I changed every password immediately. Shortly after I learned Anthony had tried accessing my email through a shared streaming account, we'd never disconnected. Then my health insurance company called to confirm a change request. Somehow he'd been listed as an emergency contact during our engagement and had called pretending to ask about our policy. Nothing catastrophic happened, but it was invasive enough to make my skin crawl. The worst came on Thursday. My boss called me into his office and asked casually if I was job searching. Someone had contacted HR pretending to be a reference checker from another company, asking about my performance, my reliability, my character. HR had shut it down, but they wanted me to know. I thanked him, went back to my desk and felt something settle into place. This wasn't grief anymore. This was harassment. That night I documented everything. Dates, times, messages, calls, attempts. I sent it all to my cousin and a family lawyer friend. Their advice was immediate and unanimous: issue a formal cease and desist and start building a paper trail for a restraining order if this continued. So that's what I did. The letter went to Anthony's parents' address, outlining every violation, every attempt to access my accounts, every fraudulent inquiry. It warned them plainly any further contact would involve legal action. I sent it certified mail and waited. The cease and desist letter landed on Anthony's parents' doorstep on a Tuesday morning. I knew because the return receipt notification hit my email before noon. For the first time since the rehearsal dinner, there was silence. No texts, no calls, no concerned friends checking in. No anonymous attempts to poke holes in my life. It was quiet in a way that felt unnatural after weeks of constant pressure, like the calm after a storm where you're not sure if the clouds are gone or just regrouping. That quiet lasted exactly 48 hours. Anthony's father called me directly on Thursday afternoon. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something told me not to ignore it. His voice was controlled, clipped the same tone he used when addressing a boardroom instead of a family dinner. He said things were getting out of hand and suggested we meet privately like adults to clear the air. He spoke as if this were a misunderstanding between equals, as if his family hadn't spent weeks harassing me, threatening me legally, and attempting to interfere with my career. "There's nothing to discuss," I said. I kept my voice calm even. I told him plainly that any further contact would involve the police. He accused me of being unreasonable, of escalating things unnecessarily. I reminded him that I had documented everything, that I had recordings, that our state allowed one-party consent. The silence on the other end stretched longer than it ever had at the restaurant. Then he said my name sharply, like a reprimand. I hung up. Blocked the number. That was the last direct contact from him. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Something that cut through the anger and exhaustion in a way nothing else had. Anthony's grandmother left me a voicemail. Her voice was soft, careful, almost trembling. She told me she was mortified by how her daughter and son-in-law had behaved, that it was disgraceful, that I didn't deserve it, that my parents didn't deserve it. She said she wanted me to know that not everyone in that family shared those values. I called her back. We spoke for 10 minutes. She apologized again, not defensively, not with excuses, just honesty. She admitted they'd always thought too highly of themselves, that Anthony had made a terrible mistake by not defending me, that some people confuse control with love. When the call ended, I sat on my couch for a long time, phone still in my hand, feeling something I hadn't felt since the engagement collapse. Closure. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Closure. But the story didn't end there. Word travels in circles like theirs, even when no one intends it to. 40 people had witnessed that rehearsal dinner. Business associates, board members, donors, people who'd been invited to admire status and polish. Instead, they saw cruelty. One of those witnesses, I later learned, through a mutual acquaintance, was on the board of the nonprofit Anthony's mother ran. He mentioned the incident casually during a meeting, not as gossip, just surprise. That comment opened a door. Others spoke up. Questions were asked. Judgment was quietly reassessed. She wasn't fired. That would have been too loud. Instead, she was encouraged to take a temporary sabbatical to focus on family matters. A polite way of saying her presence had become inconvenient. Anthony's father's consequences were more direct. A consulting venture he'd been pursuing with another retired executive fell apart. The potential partner backed out after witnessing the dinner, stating privately that he couldn't work with someone who treated people that way in public. The deal died before it ever started. I never made a call, never defended myself. I didn't have to. As for Anthony, the pressure finally seemed to crack something in him. 2 weeks after the cease and desist, a handwritten letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address, but I recognized the writing instantly. 4 pages. Apologies, explanations, admissions. He wrote about therapy, about his upbringing, about how he'd been raised to defer, to appease, to keep the peace at any cost. He acknowledged that he failed me, that he stayed silent when it mattered most. He asked for one meeting, just coffee, just to say goodbye properly. I didn't open the letter again for 2 days. I read Anthony's letter again on the 3rd morning, sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold. 4 pages of careful handwriting, every word heavy with regret, every sentence shaped by therapy language and hindsight. He wrote about fear of his parents, of confrontation, of losing their approval. He wrote about love, about how he'd always loved me, but hadn't known how to stand up to them. He admitted finally that his silence at the rehearsal dinner was a choice, not an accident. That part mattered more than all the apologies combined. I believed that he was sorry. I even believed that he'd changed at least enough to recognize his failure. But belief isn't the same thing as trust. And regret doesn't rewrite history, it only explains it. I thought about meeting him, about coffee in some neutral place, exchanging closure like a transaction, saying goodbye in a way that felt civilized and complete. I imagined his face when he'd see me, hopeful, nervous, relieved. And then I remembered the way he'd stared at his plate while his parents dismantled me in front of 40 people. I remembered the silence, not the loud kind, the kind that stretches, suffocates, and leaves you standing alone. 2 days later, I wrote back. The letter was short. I told him I'd received his apology, that I hoped therapy helped him become the person he wanted to be, that I appreciated the honesty he had finally offered. And then I told him I couldn't meet him. Not because I was angry anymore, but because there was nothing left to say. I needed him to defend me when it mattered. I needed him to choose our relationship over his parents' approval. He didn't. That moment showed me who he was, and I couldn't unsee it. I wished him well and asked him not to contact me again. I mailed it the same afternoon. The response never came. No follow-up letter, no surprise visit, no late-night texts. The silence this time felt final, not strategic. That mattered. It meant the boundary had finally been understood. With the emotional chaos settling, the practical pieces began to fall into place. I recovered more of the wedding money by reselling decorations, canceling services still within grace periods, and negotiating where I could. In total, I managed to reclaim about half of what I'd spent. I still lost around $17,000. It stung. But I had a stable job, no shared assets, and no legal ties to Anthony or his family. That perspective softened the blow. My parents stayed a few extra days before heading home, making sure I wasn't spiraling. My mother called every other day after that, sometimes just to talk about nothing. My father texted me random sports commentary like the world hadn't tilted on its axis. Their steadiness anchored me in a way I hadn't realized I needed so badly. The townhouse felt strange at first, too quiet, too full of choices that hadn't been mine alone. I rearranged the furniture, donated everything. Anthony had picked out, repainted the bedroom. I reclaimed the space piece by piece until it felt like mine again. I wasn't dating. I wasn't interested. My therapist, yes, I started seeing one, said that was healthy. That sitting with the feelings instead of rushing to replace them was progress. Some nights were harder than others. I'd lie awake thinking about the future I'd imagined, the life that vanished in the span of one speech at a rehearsal dinner. But then I'd remember the silence, his parents' silence when he finally spoke, and I knew I'd made the right call. There was one last thing I needed to say, not to him, to myself. Stop. Part 6. What silence taught me. Someone asked me recently if I regretted walking out that night, if maybe I could have handled it differently, if confronting Anthony's parents privately, instead of publicly canceling the wedding, might have led to a better outcome. It was a fair question, asked gently without judgment. I thought about it longer than I expected to. Here's the truth. Anthony had 4 years of chances, thousands of moments where he could have spoken up. Every backhanded comment about my upbringing, every subtle dig at my parents, every time his father questioned whether I could provide adequately, every holiday where I felt like a guest instead of family. Every single one of those moments was an opportunity for him to draw a line. He didn't. Not once. Not until it was already over. And even then, he only spoke when I was already walking away. That's not a partner. That's someone who wants to keep the peace at your expense. His parents got what they wanted in a way. The wedding didn't happen. But they also exposed themselves in front of 40 witnesses, damaged their carefully curated reputation, and pushed their son into therapy. Control has consequences, especially when it's exercised publicly. I didn't orchestrate their fallout. I didn't have to. I just stepped out of the way and let people see them clearly. As for me, I'm okay. Not great. Not shattered, just okay. And given everything that happened, that feels like a quiet victory. I'm rebuilding my savings. I'm focusing on work. I'm learning what it feels like to take up space without apologizing for it. The townhouse feels like home again. My parents remain my constant. My friends showed me who they really were. Some stayed. Some drifted away. That clarity was its own kind of gift. I still think about the life I thought I was building sometimes, the future that evaporated in one carefully planned speech at a rehearsal dinner. But I also think about the life I didn't end up trapped in, a life where I would have spent decades trying to earn approval that was never going to be given, a life where silence would have followed me into every conflict. I refused that future. Walking away wasn't dramatic, it was decisive. It was me choosing self-respect over acceptance, clarity over comfort, and truth over tradition. And even on the nights when it hurts, I know this much with certainty: I didn't lose a family. I saved myself. My name is Judith Wright, and I am 34 years old. For most of my adult life, I believe stability was something you built carefully measured, reinforced, and double-checked, the way I approach everything else. I work as a data analyst for a regional logistics firm, which means patterns comfort me. Numbers tell the truth, and surprises usually signal a mistake somewhere upstream. For 4 years, I thought my relationship followed the same logic. Then our house renovation began, and with it, the slow unraveling of everything I trusted. The downstairs of our home was in ruins, 60% drywall dust, 40% exposed framing. But I told myself it was temporary. Renovations always are. My boyfriend, Michael Harris, 32, had insisted the chaos would be worth it. This project was his vision, his passion. He handled the designs, hired the contractor, and talked endlessly about how the space would finally feel alive. I let him take the lead, assuming enthusiasm was a good sign. I see now that I confuse confidence with honesty. It started on a Tuesday morning, ordinary enough to slip past your defenses. My alarm went off at 6. I rolled over, expecting Michael to still be asleep, but he was already sitting upright, staring at me, as if I had said something unforgivable in my dreams. His skin looked gray, his hands damp as they clutched the blanket. "Did you listen to it?" he whispered. I blinked, still halfway inside sleep. Listen to what? The recording, he said too quickly. My sleep app. It flagged a disturbance at 3 a.m. Did you play it? I hadn't even known he used a sleep app. I don't check mine, let alone his. But the fear in his eyes woke something sharper inside me. People don't panic like that over snoring. I sat up slowly. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I heard it." The color drained from his face so fast it startled me. His mouth opened, then closed, like he was drowning on dry land. "Oh God," he breathed. "Judith, I didn't mean it. I was dreaming. Stress does that. Renovations pressure, all of it." I said nothing. Silence has weight. People rush to fill it. "It doesn't mean I love her," he continued. Words spilling out in a frantic cascade. "It was just physical. The dust, the noise, you working late, it just happened. What you heard. Me saying her name, telling her not to stop it was just sleep talk. It's over. We haven't even touched each other since the cabinets went in." My stomach dropped. "Her name," I repeated quietly. He froze. In the recording, he whispered, realization dawning too late. "I said it, didn't I? I said Clara. Clara Bennett, the contractor." I stood up. "Michael, I didn't listen to anything. I didn't even know you had that app." The tears stopped instantly, replaced by fury. "You tricked me," he shouted. "You manipulated me into confessing. That's abusive. That's sick." I answered a question, I said, reaching for my work clothes. You filled in the rest. He followed me, voice rising. "She understands me. She's creative. You're just numbers, Judith. Spreadsheets. Clara has vision." "Does her vision include finishing the backsplash you invoiced me for in July?" I asked, tying my shoes. A pillow hit the wall beside me. "You can't just leave." "I'm going to work," I said calmly. "Because one of us still has to pay for this house." I drove 3 towns over, ordered black coffee, and made 3 calls before 9 a.m. The bank, a lawyer, and a forensic home inspector. Because if there's one thing I know, it's this: when the numbers stop adding up, the truth is already hiding in the margins. 5 days passed after the confession, though calling it after felt inaccurate. Nothing had ended. The house still breathed tension through unfinished walls, exposed wiring, and half-installed cabinets that smelled faintly of sawdust and cheap adhesive. Emotionally, we were living in a sealed room with no ventilation. Michael moved into the guest bedroom, the only space Clara had never touched, the only room with a finished floor, and spent his time rotating through remorse, rage, and a baffling sense of moral superiority. In his version of events, my so-called manipulation invalidated everything he'd admitted. To him, the betrayal wasn't sleeping with another woman. It was being foolish enough to tell the truth. On the second day, I came home to find Clara sitting at our kitchen island. Not working, just sitting there, legs crossed, sipping something carbonated out of one of my glasses as if she belonged. The island was still plywood, uneven at the edges, the kind of surface that reminded you constantly that things were unfinished. Clara wore a fitted jacket that looked more suited to a lifestyle brand photo shoot than a job site, her hair perfectly styled, her posture relaxed. She looked at me like this was a meeting she had scheduled. "We need to talk," she said. She didn't stand. "Get out of my house," I replied, setting my keys down slowly. Michael appeared behind her, arms folded. "You're cutting off the funds," Clara said, ignoring my request entirely. "We have a contract. You owe me $12,000 for the marble countertops. They're on back order, but I need the deposit." "I don't have a contract with you," I said evenly. Michael signed it. "And since the joint account is frozen pending legal review, you'll need to ask him for the money." Michael stepped forward, wearing what I had come to recognize as his victim face. "You're being financially abusive," he said. "You can't just stop the renovation. We live here." I'm pausing a project that doubled as your affair location, I replied. Also, Clara, I reviewed the invoices for the custom cabinets. Funny thing, the SKU numbers match standard IKEA stock, yet you charge for handcrafted hardwood. Her smile faltered just slightly. Those are placeholders. No, I said. They're fraud. I hired an inspector. He documented unpermitted electrical work, substandard plumbing, and materials worth about 20% of what I paid. Michael gasped. You brought a stranger into the house. It's my house, I said. I bought it 2 years before we met. Your name isn't on the deed. It's on a relationship that currently doesn't exist. He screamed about sweat equity, about design, input, about emotional labor. I listened until he ran out of air. Then I told Clara she had 10 minutes to collect her tools before I called the police for trespassing and contractor fraud. For the first time, they looked at each other without confidence. In that glance, I saw the truth crystallize. She wasn't his muse. He wasn't her soulmate. They were two people who thought they were using each other, only to realize too late they were both being used. That night, Michael called his mother and told her I was jealous, controlling, and threatened by his creativity. The next morning, my lawyer called and warned me to brace for retaliation. Michael had already claimed I ran illegal surveillance inside the house. I made a sandwich in a kitchen that didn't function and found a jewelry receipt under a tarp, a men's chronograph watch, $2,500, paid for with the emergency card I paid off every month. I didn't own a watch like that, but Clara had been wearing one. I photographed the receipt and saved it in a cloud folder I titled The Vision. The folder sat quietly in my cloud drive, unassuming, almost polite. The Vision. I didn't open it right away. I knew better than to rush the process. When you're dealing with people who believe emotion outweighs evidence, timing matters as much as proof. Michael, meanwhile, mistook my silence for weakness. He grew bolder in the days that followed, strutting through the house as if moral gravity had somehow shifted in his favor, as if being exposed had freed him from accountability instead of binding him to it. By the end of the week, I understood his strategy. If he couldn't deny what he'd done, he would reframe it. He spoke about Clara as if she were a catalyst, not a choice. She inspired him, understood his frustrations, respected his creativity. He described their affair in the same vague, romanticized language people use when they don't want to look too closely at the details. I let him talk. I let him believe I was still processing emotionally, still wounded enough to be distracted. In reality, I was assembling a timeline. The watch receipt was just the beginning. Once you know where to look, patterns reveal themselves. I cross-referenced bank statements with renovations invoices, dates with withdrawals amounts, with Clara's billing schedule. Consulting fees written to cash, materials paid for twice, charges that lined up perfectly with weekends Michael claimed he was meeting suppliers. The affair wasn't just personal. It was funded, structured, deliberate. I called the jewelry store listed on the receipt and pretended to be Michael asking about the warranty. The clerk was helpful, cheerful, even until she checked the system. Oh, she said, pausing. That item was returned 4 days after purchase. Cash refund. Returned. Of course it was. That night, Michael tried to convince me we could reset. He said Clara had meant nothing, that their connection was purely situational, that he had already cut her off. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed his fantasy was still intact. I waited until he finished before asking one simple question. Why did she return the watch? He stared at me. What watch? The chronograph, I said. The one bought with our emergency card. The one she returned for cash. His face went slack. She didn't return it, he said weakly. She wears it all the time. She wears a different one now, I replied. Or she told you she does. The next morning, Clara showed up unannounced. She looked different. Tense eyes darting, her confidence dulled by urgency. She demanded her tools back and accused me of sabotaging her business. I told her calmly that she was unlicensed for a project of this scale and that I'd already checked the state registry. Her silence confirmed everything. Michael stood between us, suddenly uncertain which side he belonged on. Tell her, he said to Clara, desperation leaking into his voice. Tell her this meant something. Clara exhaled sharply. Michael, I need to get paid, she snapped. My truck's about to be repossessed. I don't have time for this. The room went still. You said you loved me, he whispered. I said what you needed to hear, she replied without hesitation. Just like you did. She turned to me, then, eyes cold but honest. You froze the accounts. She gave me a bounce check for plumbing work. I returned the watch because I needed cash. That's it. In that moment, Michael finally understood. not emotionally, intellectually. The illusion collapsed, leaving behind nothing but debt, embarrassment, and the wreckage of a choice he could no longer justify. Clara left in a hurry, tools in hand, fantasy abandoned. I watched Michael sink into himself, the entitlement draining away, replaced by something small and frightened. I opened my laptop and added a new subfolder inside the vision. Fraud. If the affair had been the explosion, what followed was fallout, slow, radioactive, and impossible to escape. Michael did not leave the house. His lawyer advised him to stay put, to establish residency, to occupy space as leverage. So we became roommates, trapped in a structure that reflected exactly what our relationship had become: unfinished, unsafe, and filled with hazards you didn't notice until it was too late. The walls were still open in places, wires hanging like exposed nerves. At night, the house creaked and popped, as if protesting our presence. Michael decided his best defense was normalization. He labeled shelves in the refrigerator with masking tape, claiming half of everything. He moved a beanbag chair, a standing lamp, and a speaker into the guest room and treated it like a studio apartment. He wore noise-canceling headphones almost constantly, walking past me, as if I were a stranger, as if ignoring me could undo what he had already destroyed. The entitlement was almost impressive in its consistency. Then came the flooring. I received a notification from our smart doorbell while I was at work. A delivery truck idled in the driveway, a forklift unloading a pallet of hardwood. I hadn't ordered flooring. I had canceled every pending renovation purchase days earlier. I drove home at lunch, my chest tight with the familiar calm that precedes confrontation. Michael was outside signing paperwork with a flourish. When he saw me, he smiled like he'd won something. "What is this?" I asked. "Brazilian koa," he said proudly. "For the living room." I reordered it. "With what money?" He flipped his hair back, defensive. "The joint card. My lawyer says you can't cut me off from my standard of living. Renovating this house is my standard of living." "The joint card has a limit," I said. "I lowered it to $500 last week." His face drained. "The guy said it went through." "It went through because I haven't removed you as an authorized user yet," I replied. "But I set a transaction cap. How much was this?" "$4,000, he whispered. "Then it didn't go through," I said calmly. "Did you write a check?" He hesitated, post-dated. "That account has $12 in it," I said. "That check is going to bounce so hard it'll crack the pavement." The delivery driver looked uncomfortable. I told him to take the pallet back. As the forklift reversed, Michael turned on me, shouting about sabotage, about jealousy, about how I couldn't stand that he'd had passion with someone else. I let him finish. "Speaking of Clara," I said quietly, "I found the receipt for the watch." He froze. "That was a thank you gift." I called the store, I continued. She returned it for cash 4 days later. The truth landed heavily. 10 minutes later, Clara's car screeched into the driveway. She looked panicked, not powerful. She banged on the door, threatening lawsuits, breach of contract, lost materials. I informed her that she was unlicensed and that her tools were already on the curb. Rain clouds were gathering. She left without another word. Michael stood in the hallway, staring at the floor. The fantasy was dead now, undeniably so. I told him about the forensic audit, the consulting fees, the checks written to cash, embezzlement of shared funds. My lawyer would be adding fraud. "You can't do that," he said faintly. "You're not my partner anymore," I replied. "You're my liability." The day Clara came back, it wasn't with confidence or charm. It was with panic wrapped in bravado so thin it barely held together. I heard her before I saw her tires screeching. A door slamming. Footsteps pounding up the driveway like she was running out of time. Michael was in the hallway when the knock came. His shoulders tense, his face already prepared for disappointment even if he didn't know it yet. I opened the door. Clara didn't bother with pleasantries. "I'm suing you," she announced, pointing a finger at my chest. "Breach of contract. You locked me out of my job site. I have materials in there." "You have a box of rusted nails and a fantasy you sold at a markup," I replied. "And you were never licensed to take on a project this size. I checked the registry. You're a handyman, Clara. $30,000 cap. This job was double that." Her jaw tightened. She glanced past me at Michael, who had stepped closer, hope flickering in his eyes despite everything. "Tell her," he said. "Tell her what we meant." Clara exhaled, sharply irritated. "Michael, I need to get paid. My truck is getting repossessed. I don't have time for this." The words hit harder than shouting ever could. "You said you loved me," he whispered. "I said what kept the checks coming," she snapped. "You gave me bounced checks for plumbing. Your girlfriend froze the accounts. I returned the watch because I needed cash. That's it. Silence filled the house, thick and suffocating. Michael looked at her like a stranger, like someone he had invented and was now watching dissolve. "I blew up my life for you," he said. "No," she replied coldly. "You blew it up because you were bored." She turned back to me, demanding her tools. I told her they were already outside. She rushed past me, rain beginning to fall, scrambling to load them before the weather turned. When she drove away, she didn't look back. Michael collapsed onto the stairs, face in his hands. The entitlement was gone now, stripped away by reality. I told him about the audit results, the cash withdrawals, the evidence. Fraud would be added to the legal filing. His voice was barely audible when he asked what would happen next. "What happens," I said, "is that this stops being a story you tell yourself." The final meeting didn't happen in a courtroom. There were no raised voices, no dramatic speeches, no moment where anyone slammed a folder shut and stormed out. It took place in a small conference room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet, the kind of room designed to drain emotion from everything that enters it. Michael sat across from me at the table, his posture slumped, his confidence long gone. This was not the man who had once talked about vision and passion, as if those words excused anything. This was someone trying to calculate how badly he had misjudged the cost of his choices. My lawyer laid the documents out slowly, methodically, like a surgeon preparing instruments. The fraud was undeniable. $18,000 in so-called consulting fees and material costs had been routed directly to Clara's personal account, with portions withdrawn in cash and unaccounted for. The unlicensed work was documented in photographs and inspection reports. Because Clara was not legally permitted to manage a project of this scale, the renovation did not increase the value of the house. It reduced it. I would have to pay a legitimate contractor to undo and correct the damage before anything could be finished safely. Michael's lawyer attempted to argue emotional contribution attachment to the home and what she called my controlling financial behavior. My lawyer responded by sliding the bank statements across the table. Charges made after separation, the flooring delivery, the bounce check, the attempt to continue spending money that no longer existed. One by one, his arguments collapsed under their own weight. Michael finally spoke. "I just want what's fair," he said quietly. "I gave years of my life to this relationship. You took tens of thousands of dollars from me," I replied, my voice steady. "You used it to fund an affair and a fraud. That's the balance sheet." The settlement was brutal in its simplicity. The house remained mine. The debt incurred after separation belonged to him. There would be no support payments. We traded criminal charges for a clean break. He signed the paperwork with shaking hands, the pen pressing so hard into the page it almost tore through. I left the building alone. The air outside felt different, lighter somehow, as if I had stepped out of a sealed environment and could finally breathe. The house is still unfinished. The island is gone. I tore out the plywood myself one afternoon with a crowbar, the splintering wood, giving way easily as if it had never belonged there in the first place. It was surprisingly therapeutic. The floor is bare subfloor, now clean and honest. I hired a new contractor, an older man named Stanley, who writes everything down in a notebook and measures twice before cutting once. He doesn't talk about vision. He talks about safety and time. "Good work takes patience," he told me. I agreed. Last night, out of curiosity, I opened the sleep app on my phone and turned it on. This morning, I listened to the recording. 8 hours of silence. No murmuring, no confessions, no chaos bleeding into the dark. Just peace.